you've been able to get something to eat prior to coming here, because there's no food served as far as I'm aware. I'm David Conrad, CTO of ICANN, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak here. I'm going to be talking on something that causes my eyes to roll, because I've been talking about it for so long, but hopefully not everyone in the audience has seen these set of slides before. And I'm talking about rolling the DNS root key based on input from many ICANN communities. I'll start off with some introductions, then talk about how we've gotten to where we are, and actually where are we, what's happening next, the implications of the situation we find ourselves in, and how you can help. So a little bit about me. I'm ICANN CTO. I have been tasked with the responsibility of breaking the internet, also known as rolling the root key. Which, if there are any lawyers in the room, I don't actually mean breaking the internet. That's a joke. Please don't quote me on that. My comms people came up with this slide thinking it would be really, really funny. And then we came really close to actually that coming into happenstance. So what we're actually trying to do is avoid this sort of scenario where my face shows up in places where I'd really like it not to be. And part of this talk is to try to help me not show up on the cover of Time and CNN, etc. Talking a little bit about ICANN, I'm sure pretty much everyone here knows what ICANN is, love it or hate it. For the purposes of this discussion, I'll keep it relatively short. We are a global, multi-stakeholder, bottom-up, consensus-driven organization. We are the IANA functions operator, and the reason that we're involved in this is because rolling the KSK for the root zone is part of the IANA names function. Back in 2010, with the help of some people who actually sit in this room, hello, Joe, we actually rolled the key, or created the key for the first time, and promised the community that after 5 years, we would roll the key. And we proceeded to wait a little longer than 5 years, say after 5 years, so it was sort of after 5 years. We also, with the community, developed the KSK rollover plan. We actually dragooned a bunch of the community, some usual suspects from the DNS technical community, to help us develop the KSK rollover plan, and have since been sort of executing that plan. We began rolling in October of 2016. Because of the way we do things with the root KSK, we could only touch it on quarter boundaries. So every quarter we would do something new. And just before we were about to use the new KSK in anger, we decided that maybe that wasn't the best idea. ICANN does a few other things. You might have heard about the new GTLD program, which I'm sure is incredibly popular within this community. We develop TLD policy. We accredit those friendly folks, the registrars. We actually create new RIRs, although I don't think new continents have been discovered, so the chances that a new RIR will be created are probably relatively small. We do allocate blocks of addresses to the RIRs, and in the case of addresses that are being used for protocol purposes, we allocate it directly to the IETF. We administer the protocol parameter registries. There are almost 2,000 of them, Kim, is that right? Like 2,000-ish protocol parameter registries. Yeah, the IETF creates them, and we administer them on behalf of the IETF. We attempt to herd the cats known as the root server operators through an organization called RSSAC. We have no control over the root server operators except the one we operate in. Sometimes I wonder about that. But we do facilitate the discussions among the root server operators to try to help coordinate the root server system and a few other things. I'm actually not going to talk about any of that more than all I've just said. The ICANN ecosystem, we're actually sort of three parts. There is the community, which I'm sure you will be excited to know you are considered part of the ICANN community. There is the organization, the folks who actually do stuff, and the board, the folks that actually tell us in the organization to do stuff. The communities, so there are a bunch of them. This eye chart, my comms team tends to create very interesting presentations that you can't read, so I will try to explain this. So it's basically a set of different parts of the community that include businesses, government and governmental organizations, academia, internet users. We attempt to provide a way in which standard everyday internet users can provide input into ICANN policies. Civil society, domain name businesses, technical communities as well. And all of these are folks that we ask to provide input into pretty much everything we do. These communities actually shape ICANN policies. The organization actually tries to describe these policies to all parts of its community so that they can participate in developing the policies and modifying them and beating us over the head with them. The technical communities get the joy of being able to comment on things like our budget and how we engage with governments. And the non-technical community gets to provide input on things like the root KSK and how it's managed and the way we manage the root zone itself. Predictably, this can result in some entertaining discussions if you enjoy watching sort of demolition derbies. The DNSSEC work that ICANN has been on is almost entirely community-driven. We have had extensive community input on signing the root, developing the DNSSEC policy statement, the DPS, that's used for the root. We have these things called the trusted community representatives. They are folks who ensure that the key ceremonies that we perform are done in a way that everyone can trust. As I mentioned, we had the community help us extensively on the development on the KSK rollover plan. And what is this technical community? Well, it's folks who participate in the DNSOP working group here at the IETF, folks who participate in DNS OARC, the DNS Operations and Research Center, I believe, Operation Analysis and Research Center. There's this thing called the DNSSEC deployment mailing list that has been in operation now for like a decade plus, has a bunch of usual suspects on it. The various DNSSEC related workshops all over the planet, and ICANN's technical advisory committees, including the Security and Stability Advisory Committee and the Root Server System Advisory Committee. We also have gotten input from the Government Advisory Committee and the At-Large Advisory Committee, that last one being the one that tries to present the views of internet users. With regards to DNSSEC, most of the input we've received is perhaps unsurprisingly coming from the technical community. We have received input related to DNSSEC from business community sometimes and others, but by far the majority of input comes from people who actually pretend to understand what it is they're commenting on. So, how did we get to where we are? The root has been signed since 2010. If you remember way back when, a guy named Dan Kaminsky came out with a really cool way of being able to poison caches that DNSSEC would actually prevent. So there was a mad rush, and after a bit of screaming and pulling out hair, we ended up coming up with a way of signing the root zone. We were able to sign it in July of 2010, after which I promptly resigned and went into Death Valley for a couple of days, because what else would one do when one signs the root? Things went along reasonably normally, and in 2013, we actually started the process of developing a plan to roll the KSK, the trust anchor that was generated when we signed the root. A slight intermission occurred, something called the transition of the IANA functions, which sort of took the oxygen out of pretty much everything that ICANN did for a couple of years. But after the transition was finished in September 30th of 2016, we sort of jumped back into the KSK rollover and proceeded to develop through community input a plan and started the rollover in October of 2016. In February of 2017, we actually installed the newly generated KSK in both of the key management facilities that ICANN operates, one on the east coast of the US, the other on the west coast of the US. In April of 2017, an interesting document was published, RFC 8145, which described a way in which resolvers could inform the root of what keys were actually configured for the KSK. That would become interesting later on. In July of 2017, we published the new KSK into the root for the first time. The packets got bigger. Nothing broke, surprisingly. Some folks figured that when we grew the size of the DNS response from the root that bad things would happen. Turns out no one really even noticed, as far as we know. We didn't see anyone screaming in outrage, so that's how we assume success when we don't get yelled at. In 19th of September 2017, the DNSK response increased from the root servers. And then on 27 September, we decided maybe this KSK rollover thing needed to be stopped for a little while. Why did we do that? Well, I mentioned RFC 8145. That was published by Dwayne Wessels back in April. People started implementing it. Bind had done an implementation based on the draft, and Unbound implemented it in April. And in May, Dwayne started collecting data. And sort of something interesting happened. Things happened the way they should, according to 5011, and the way that I'm forgetting the word, when we transition the keys. That's not the right word, but that'll work for me now. And we noticed that things were going along as they probably should have, except that little space there at the end where the red line is above the blue line indicated that not everybody was migrating over to the new key. It meant that some folks still had only the old key configured. And that blue line is actually even weirder. That means that people were pre-configuring the new key even though it wasn't in use, which meant that their resolvers would fail everything because the new key wasn't actually being signed. But, you know, it happens. It's the internet. I'm surprised every day when I wake up and it still works. But that percentage there where things were not where they should be, where it was above zero and did not seem to be going down, made us a little nervous. Of course, I was planning, you know, when I signed the root, I went off to Death Valley after that. I was actually planning to be on vacation after we rolled the key because I don't want to be around when shit breaks. But I was actually in the O'Hare lounge, United Lounge at O'Hare, and I called up folks at ICANN and said, you know, maybe it's best if we do not do this this KSK roll right now, and instead let's just postpone it for a while and see what's actually happening and figuring out why exactly it wasn't going to zero like we all thought it should. Okay, come back here. There we go. So when you're faced with an unknown, there's sort of three options you can take. One is you run around with your hair on fire, which we did a little bit of. Two, stay the course, which some people suggested we do. And three, try to figure out what was going on. In general, running around with your hair on fire is not the best idea. I've tried it many times. Doesn't seem to come out very well. And staying the course, given that I really didn't want to appear on CNN and Time and that sort of stuff, seemed like a bad idea. So we decided to try to figure out what's going on. We postponed the rollover. We didn't sign with the KSK 2017 yet. We didn't pull it out, so it's still there. It's still, we can use it at any time, modulo it has to happen on quarters. But we decided to try to replicate Dwayne's results, and we did. So we decided to further replicate Dwayne's results, try to figure out exactly what was going on. And we wanted to try to understand why so many resolvers, and at that time it was between 4 and 8% of the resolvers, were not migrating to the new key. Figured we'd informally consult with the community, develop a new plan to allow the key to move forward, get an actual approval from sort of the community one way or another, because in the previous incarnation we had sort of said, well, We agreed to roll the key after 5 years when we signed in 2010. NTIA, the US government at the time, said, well, that means that you've agreed to do the rollover after 5 years, so you don't need any additional permission. NTIA is now gone, so we thought it'd probably be good to have somebody else that we can say they made us do it. And then roll the stupid key. So in October through December, we actually hired a usual suspect, hi Joe, to try to track down the IP addresses that we were seeing from the resolvers, to try to figure out why they were still stuck on KSK 2010 and why they were not advertising KSK 2010 and 2017. So the findings that we got back from our friends was that only 20% of the IP addresses that were showing up in these 8145 announcements could be tracked down, and 60% of those were found in dynamic address pools, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If it's a resolver, then either it's serving the person on the laptop that just got the dynamic address, or it's something else going on that we didn't fully understand. And it looked like about 25% of the addresses were forwarding from other resolvers, which meant that there was a layer of indirection that would be very hard for us to peek through. We didn't find a smoking gun single cause. We did identify a couple of bugs and a couple of resolver implementations. And as a result of that, we didn't really have a clear path forward. Since we didn't have a path forward, we decided, to do what the organization does when we're confused. We go and ask the community, hopefully get someone to tell us what to do. So we actually did an informal collection of input using a mailing list that had been set up when we first started discussing doing the KSK rollover, kskrollover@icann.org. That mailing list still exists. If you're interested in these sorts of things, I recommend you jump on it. It's pretty low volume right now, but hopefully that'll pick up when we come closer to breaking the internet. Again, that's a joke. We're not going to break the internet. The results of the discussion on that informal mailing list was that there's no real way to measure how many users are going to be impacted by rolling the root KSK. The information we're getting is sort of a sample of resolvers, and those resolvers are actually early adopters because the only code that has the 8145 announcements is very new code. It's likely that better measurements will come along in the future, something called KSK Sentinel, which is wandering its way through the DNS hop process right now, does look like it could provide us with information that's actually from the end user's perspective. And that would be very helpful, but that's going to take a little while. The consensus on the mailing list was that we should just roll the key. We acknowledge that some resolvers are going to have issues, but that's what happens on the internet. Stuff breaks, and then you just adjust and move on. But in order to try to minimize the amount of stuff that breaks, we're going to aggressively outreach and do these kinds of talks and go into even odder places to talk about, how the KSK roll was going to happen and all that sort of thing. And all at the same time, we'll continue to collect data. So on the topic of collecting data, so these trust anchor reports, right now, we have access to data from almost all of the root servers, A, B, C, D, E, F, I, J, K, L, and M. The initial analysis that we had done came from B, D, and F. The initial analysis that Dwayne had done was from A and J, but all of the statistics were more or less sort of the same. We're using some software that Dwayne has actually developed that's actually really nice. And that gives you an idea of sort of what we're looking at in terms of the data. But what are we actually seeing? Well, so this is from September, and you'll notice that there was a bit of a spike, and that spike seems to have steadied around 20-ish%, a little higher than that. The black line is the percentage. The red and green lines are the numbers if you look on the, what is that? That's dyslexia is a joyful thing, the left side of the scale. So it went up from about 4 to 8% upwards of 20+%, which is also a bit disturbing because that's the wrong way this should be going. It should be going down, not up. Why the jump in January? Our best hypothesis is that there was a completely unrelated security fix that went into a DNS server implementation that caused people to update their DNS server implementation, and that resulted in more 8145 announcements because it's default on in that resolver, and the same with bind. Why didn't we see the a drop off in 2010 after 30 days? Because new resolvers, so it should learn through the 5011 process, and then the hold down timer, that's the word I was looking for, would kick in and it would drop the 2010. Well, don't know. One of the thoughts is that there are a bunch of ephemeral virtual machines that are, sort of statically configured. They get booted up and they have the old configuration. That may be one reason we're seeing all these 2010 only type things, but we don't really know. Another interesting bit of data. So these are the unique IPs added per day. The odd bit about this is the number sort of stabilizes, more or less, plus or minus 5 or 10%. But that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? I mean, these are resolvers that people are sort of adding, when they go and update software and something like that. But they're sort of stabilizing in the 15K per day of new IP addresses. And that is odd because it's consistent. It's not, it's not going up and down enough. It's not going up. Anyhow. So another thing we don't fully understand. Cumulative IP addresses over time. And that, that line there, the green line, sort of in a very nice, even growth. Is weird. It shouldn't do that really. There's so many things we don't understand about the internet. But we're talking about actually a pretty good chunk of unique IP addresses at this stage. We're up to about 730,000 unique IP addresses that are announcing 8145. And worrisomely enough, about a third of those are reporting only KSK 2010. Why? Don't know. It could be forwarders, could be VMs, as we mentioned. There were a couple, relatively speaking, 1,500, that went from one KSK 2010 only to 2010 plus 2017, which is the right thing to happen, but it's actually not a whole lot. It's only 1,500 out of 730,000. So that's also disturbing. Where are we getting these announcements from? Well, this shows you the top 30 ASNs sending RFC 8145 data. And, that's an interesting set of ISPs and network operators. Actually, Roy, is this only the 2010 ones, or is this all of them aggregated? I don't remember.
This is only the 2010.
Okay, so these are folks who are announcing only the 2010 KSK, which means that when we roll the key, these folks, these resolutions are going to start failing. And these are, in many cases, these are customers of ISPs, right? So, we have Comcast there at 9,000 unique IP addresses. This isn't Comcast itself. Comcast, they're operated by some really intelligent folks and do a really good job. It's folks behind Comcast, people, business clients presumably or something. A lot of this is just purely guesswork, but it does lead one to some concern about what's going to happen when we do roll the key. You have a question, Dan?
Dan York, do you want questions now or do you want to wait? Or
we can take them now.
Well, so I'm just curious about that. The 14,000, you're seeing 14,000 new resolvers reporting data every day?
Yep.
Are you seeing a corresponding drop-off? I mean, do you see some that are no longer reporting things, or is this just cumulative? You're adding 14 to 15K?
These are cumulative. And Roy will jump up and scream at me when I say stuff wrong, so I feel comfortable doing that.
He's good at that, yeah. Okay, so somehow there's just 14 or 15 new ones being added
1,000.
K.
Yes, a day.
Wow. All right.
Yeah, it's weird. Warren.
So, Warren Clary, I guess I should point out that RFC 8145 doesn't have any sort of authentication.
Yes.
Somebody can just ship you a packet.
Yep.
So there's a reasonable hypothesis that many of those are spoofed.
But who would do that? That would be mean. Warren.
Somebody just wanting to mess with you? Never.
Okay. Yes, that is a known aspect. I don't want to say flaw, but an aspect of 8145. That there is no mechanism by which we can assure these aren't spoofed, and it could very well be some 400-pound person in their basement sending 8145 queries to the root just to screw with us. That would really depress me, though. So what's happening next? We're going to continue to try to figure out what's going on, but we do have very limited data. This has been a real challenge for this exercise. One of the things that we have discovered is that the tools that we have to monitor the infrastructure are, shall we say, a bit lacking. And as a result, we need to continually ask the community for help. And unfortunately, the community doesn't, there are not a lot of good communication channels into this community because they're resolver operators, and anyone and everyone can run a resolver. I used to run one on my laptop, and if some weirdo called me up and said, what's your trust anchor, I'd probably get very nervous. So this has been an ongoing challenge, but we are, what else can we do? We're going to continue to try to figure out what's going on. We're going to continue to revise the plan to move forward based on input that we receive from the community, and given what data that we have. We are going to ask for formal advice from ICANN's advisory committees. It's part of the ICANN process. The advisory committees represent parts of the community, and they will provide us with they'll actually provide the board with formal advice. And those include the Security Stability Advisory Committee and the Root Service System Advisory Committee. And then we are going to request formal approval from ICANN's board to move forward. We will provide them a briefing, including formal advice from the advisory committees and all the data that they are able to eat. One of the interesting aspects of this is ICANN's board is not, as perhaps is not surprising, fully technical. We do have some quite technical folks on ICANN board, but we also have non-technical folks. And ultimately, it will be ICANN's board that will be making the decision because this, obviously can have impact on both the internet as a whole and ICANN as an organization, and they have a fiduciary responsibility to the organization, so they get to take the bullet on this. Community assistance, right now, so Matt Larson, my Vice President of Research, has put up a page at that URL that allows you to see on a monthly basis right now, because we haven't fully automated it, what the sort of the statistics are with regards to 8145 announcements. It's updated weekly, not monthly, like I just said. I get confused. We have a list, a very large list, and increasing at 15K a day list of unique IP addresses. And we've approached other parts of the community to try to help us figure out who these folks are and why they are configuring only KSK 2010. The folks we've been speaking to are the regional internet registries and ICANN's internet service provider and connectivity provider constituencies, which represents some number of fairly large telcos and ISPs. And we're hoping to get those folks to work with their customers and their participants to update the systems that support the KSK 2017 and try to tell us, why things are happening the way they are, because honestly, it's a bit confusing. We're trying to figure out how we can make this list of IP addresses more available, but it gets really kind of bogged down in whether or not IP addresses are PII and GDPR and lawyers and stuff that just causes my eyes to cross. Moving forward, ICANN has published a draft plan on how to proceed. And within that plan, it says, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. We are going to roll the key on October 11th, 2018. As part of the informal discussions, we weren't able to identify any measurable criteria by which we would say yes or no, so we're just going to say yes, because that's what we do. We're going to continue doing extensive outreach, as much as we can. We will continue to publish more observations, as much data as we can get, and if people have ideas on how to interpret that data or other ways in which we can obtain data, we're looking forward to hearing from you. Most importantly, we have a public comment going on. Part of the ICANN process is that we write up stuff and then we throw it to the community for a actual public comment period, sort of somewhat equivalent to a last call within the IETF, and say, please tell us what you think, provide that input. So we are in the process of that public comment period. It ends on April 2nd, and I strongly request, I'm begging here, to please provide input. This is the plan. So on April 2nd, that the public comment will end. We're going to write a report, sort of trying to interpret those comments, and we will, in May, actually ask the board for a resolution to ask SFAT, because the way ICANN works, you got to ask the board to ask folks. We can't just ask folks directly because it's ICANN. And RSEC, yeah, sorry, that was an accident left out. So we're going to do another session at the ICANN meeting in Panama, trying to get more community input through a workshop. Presumably sometime around there, SAC will be able to provide the input back. We will publish a final plan, and the message that the role is contingent on that final plan. The board, we will tell the board, this is the input from the community, and currently the plan is that we will request the board permission to roll the key on October 11th, and then on October 11th, I will be on vacation. Implications, well, so on October 11th of 2018, assuming the plan doesn't get modified, we know 100% certainty that some resolvers are going to break. I mean, the data is very clear. Resolvers are going to only have KSK 2010 when they try to validate stuff that's signed with KSK 2017 are not going to work. Even I know that. Currently, that number is between 20 and 30%. But we don't know what that means because we don't know how many users are behind those resolvers. It may be no one. It may be hundreds of people. We have no clue. We believe, and I think the technical community believes, that the vast majority of users who are being subjected to DNSSEC validation are behind very large resolvers like Google's Public DNS or Comcast or Quad9 or those folks. And we have no fears about them. These folks are professionally operated. They're not going to screw up the KSK role, we believe. But that's just a belief. We don't actually have concrete data to prove that at this stage. Just as an aside to the IETF, as you're developing protocols that have impact on, say, critical infrastructure, it'd be really good to have measurement points within those protocols so that when you're in a point where you're actually going to be mucking with the critical infrastructure, that you can actually measure things. So just as a future aside, that would actually be something that would be nice to think about instead of how we've done it with the NSX, which is add it later. Really? I don't need that now. I keep getting these announcements on my computer. Oops. A final decision by ICANN board will be non-technical because we don't have the data to give the board to make a technical decision. And if we did have the data, then they wouldn't need to make the decision because the technical data would say what we should do. So the board will be doing a risk-benefit analysis on limited data. One of the reasons the public input is so important is the board is going to need to take in the input from the community to help in their decision-making processes. So, how you can help. If I haven't terrified you with the idea of DNSSEC validation, it'd be really helpful if you would turn it on, making sure that you support KSK role, really. And tell your operator network friends, hey, DNSSEC is a good thing. Turn on validation. It'll all work out. Just make sure you support the KSK 2017. Provide input to ICANN on this public comment associated with KSK role. It's been open now for about 20 days, 25 days, something like that. Month and a half, a while. It closes on April 2nd, so there are 11 days left. To date, we have 7, count them 7 comments. And I think most of them are in this room. Yes, they're all in this room, I think. So it would be useful to have more input, and if you're repeating stuff that other people have said in the public, that's fine. That's helpful. That shows that there's more people than just the usual suspects who believe the KSK role should continue. If you think maybe it shouldn't continue, that's really useful information as well. I do know that some folks are going to come out against the KSK role. That's fine. We just need that input. And that, again, is the URL, so I would strongly beg you, please provide input. And with that, I'm happy to answer any other questions that anyone might have. Yonea-san.
This is Yoshiro Yonea. So I'm not representative of Japanese operators community, but as far as I heard from some major ISPs in Japan, they said that they do not rely on RFC 5011. So they will change the trust anchor by hand if the timing will come. And they will prepare for the formation who will watch what's happening on that KSK rollover timing. So I believe that KSK rollover will not failure in the major ISPs. Mm-hmm. And I think one good challenge for the operators is to conduct a questionnaire about their preparedness and how they will turn on the new KSK. So if I can provide a template of the questionnaire, I will translate it in Japanese and I will ask to the Japanese operators group, such as JANOC. So such kind of information gathering with a common template would help the plan of the KSK rollover. So I believe I can do that immediately.
That is a lovely idea, and we will definitely take you up on that. Oh, and for the folks who are not following 5011, and I understand completely, you can today add KSK 2017. Don't take out KSK 2010, that would be bad, but you can add KSK 2017 and the right thing will happen.
Hi, Lars Lehmann from NetNode. I have a few questions. So that one actually came in later slides. You talked about dynamic addresses, and you saw queries coming from dynamic addresses. Could they possibly be coming from homes which are dynamically allocated on cable systems or with fiber systems, what have you?
Yep, definitely could be.
Yeah,
yep.
So that's VMs. Yes,
yep.
Good. Right.
Yep. VMs. VMs, homes, could be many things.
Another question.
Cell phones, maybe.
How do you count the number of unique addresses?
Sorry, how do we count the number of unique addresses?
Yes.
Is there a mic? Actually, right, if you could go, just in case for... I was going to be snarky and say, well, we count the ones that are unique, but that doesn't help, actually.
This works. I use an angle. We count them in two ways. One is the unique number of addresses per day. So basically, we literally look at the query log where Dwayne's tool sends all his data to. That query log contains all the unique, contains all the addresses. We basically count the unique addresses per day, but we accumulate over all letters. So, and the second thing is we also do the accumulated part, where we have a day, we add the next day, we add the third day, etc., etc.
But I would like to argue there that if you count the unique since we operate one of the root servers and participate in this, we report a summary. We don't report the actual addresses to you, do we?
I apologize if this comes as a surprise, but you do actually report the addresses to us.
So many things about the internet we don't know.
Right. That actually takes up my fourth question as well. So thank you so much.
Microphone reset. Hello, Jim.
Hello, David. Thank you very much for this gesture in IETF diversity and height issues. Thank you for that. One possible community, David, I don't know if ICANN has made any kind of outreach to are the operating system vendors and the Linux distro people, because I suspect that's where some of these trust anchors are being embedded. So it's unlikely we're going to see this, I think, say in the commercial distributions from Oracle and HP and stuff like that.
Yep.
But there might be some substantial traction there with the Linux folks, just embedding something and hardwiring it into whatever they distribute with the code base for a resolving name server. And also the next follow-on for that is also CPE vendors, because I'd imagine quite a lot of the stuff they're probably embedding maybe.
Right.
But just cutting and pasting a configuration of a bind setup or an unbound setup, and that's what's getting blasted into the images that are going out from Cable Labs and from Technicolor and anybody else that's making all that crapware. Have you had a chance to deal with any of those guys?
So we have, actually very early on, we made contact with the guy who maintains DNS Mask, which is actually the most commonly, as far as we can tell, embedded DNS related thingy that's put into CPE. He said he's never going to support 5011, but he does have sort of a separate daemon that sits there and goes and polls to see if the root KSK has changed on the IANA website and then pulls it down. That in and of itself makes me a little nervous, because the idea of millions of CPE going and polling IANA's website but you know, whatever works, right? So at this stage, the CPE have some confidence in, very few, as far as I know, actually enable DNSSEC. So, you know, obviously if you're not doing DNSSEC, all of this talk is completely meaningless to you. With regards to operating system vendors, we have been in contact with a number of Linux distribution folks. You know, Red Hat, for example, Paul Luder was actually on the community team that was doing this. Yeah, and he's sitting right over there. By and large, they've been supportive. We have not, to my knowledge, interacted with sort of the commercial OS vendors. That's something that I'll look into. I know we had discussed it. I don't know if we actually executed on that prior to the KSK. Yeah, let's say, yeah. So we have. So yeah.
Okay, one other question, David. Again, this perhaps is a stupid one. Have you any data on of these offending IP addresses? How many of them are actually doing validation?
Hard for us to tell.
Okay.
Paul Hoffman, co-author of 8145. 8145 says, don't send the data if you're not doing validation. Now, we don't actually know that they're doing validation, but we know that there was a chunk of code that was hard to implement, that if they were doing that, they shouldn't have done it if they weren't validating.
Yeah, there is that, Paul. And of course, the other possibility is they've got the validating resolvers to fail safe. If validation fails, just continue returning unsigned data and unverified data.
Right. So yeah, so you're correct. We don't know that we did actually do a fair amount of research on the open source software, and we didn't see any that would send the 8145 data if it was not validating. But that doesn't mean there isn't a funny configuration, because we did find some funny configurations that were politely not called bugs, but they were bugs before. And so there could be something like that. That's not what we're sort of assuming now, though. Yeah.
Gonna have to close the queues because Dan and because time's running up. But Joe.
Yeah, I'm just a quick idea. You pulled out in the slide quite nicely that you don't have a good way of mapping the number of end users to a resolver. But I think it's also worth mentioning that you also don't have a good way of mapping addresses to resolvers.
Yes.
I mean, that assumption, which kind of appears in a couple of slides, is is based on this old idea of from the sysadmin era 20 years ago when you installed a machine and it stayed there at the same address for a long period of time,
Right.
which is also kind of a basic assumption of 5011. But in fact, the architecture has changed. There's V4 runout, there's carrier grade NAT, there's ephemeral workloads, there's all kinds of overloading of addresses and services that there's no way to see past this data and find out.
Right.
So the fact that you see a linear increase in the number of addresses reporting doesn't necessarily mean that you see a linear increase in the number of resolvers. It could be the same population of resolvers.
Just migrating through CGN
But
blocks.
as viewed from upstream, they look different because you've got layers of NAT that are rotating through address pools.
Yep.
So it's really interesting data, but it's really hard to conclude more from it than we don't know what it means,
Right.
as you said.
Yes, it is data that the more you look into it, the more you realize that it actually isn't telling you anything useful.
Yeah, Frederico Neves. I have two questions and one comment. The first question is, how many of those addresses are IPv6?
That is a
Don't know.
Don't know.
Okay.
Off the top of my head.
We have to take into account the privacy extensions, and so the second observation is regarding those IP addresses that we have investigated if they are validating or not. We look at for those same IP address resolvers asking for DNS keys or DS records, or how we did that, the investigation. I mean, it's basically for Paul that he said.
Quick answer is we didn't actually look at the addresses. I looked at software. I actually looked at the software
okay.
paths.
Okay.
But that's a good question for Roy to do sometime very soon, because that's actually a reasonable thing to ask.
And the comment and observation is that we are really being misled by this data, because if we had 700,000 validating resolvers, we would be really good.
Yes. Yeah, that is one of the interesting aspects of this is we're getting indications that cannot be true, right? So clearly the data, as I said, the more we look into that data, the more we realize that data isn't actually telling us anything that's helpful. And that is the sort of the consensus of the sort of the expert opinion that led us to say, okay, we're just going to roll the key on 11 October 2018, regardless of what the 8145 data says. And Dan.
So thanks, Dave, for coming out and providing this level of information and doing this kind of thing. I think that's really important there. I guess I'd have two things. One is just putting my marketing communications kind of hat on. I would say I would encourage you to look at how to focus on like a landing page. Like I didn't see anywhere in there. You've got a great URL, icann.org/KSKRoll, which drops you into a landing page as a whole bunch of stuff. And I'd encourage you to push that rather than the long ones that go across there that my old eyes can't even read on some parts of that. So I'd encourage you to do that. The other piece is, I think one of the things, so last fall, I gave a presentation at the ISC2 Security Congress talking about this, and I had been big letters. What are you doing on October 11th? It was great, and it was the day before you announced the delay. So then I had to kind of go, oh, whoops, sorry. But there's a lot in the enterprise space, I think, they had no idea about it, much of this. And when I was talking to them, and they're all operating large private networks that they do their own DNS lookups. Some of them are doing DNS sec validation and other pieces. And I'm not quite sure how, but I'd say that's an audience that certainly needs to be looked at in some way. Agreed. And
we have tried on several occasions to go through like the CTO forum, the CIO forum, and those sorts of organizations to try to get more access into the enterprise communities. But that is a very large, very diverse community.
It is.
And it has been challenging. But thank you.
Yes, and just roll the damn thing, will you?
Roll it, yeah. I've heard that before. Again, thank you very much for taking the time and listening to me ramble on. Just, provide input, please. Thank you.
where you're going. Brothers on the slide. What you gonna hide?